It's my honor and pleasure to be here with Professor Aaron Hahn Tapper, who is a professor at the University of San Francisco and in the Theology and Religious Studies Department, and also is the founder and director of the Jewish Studies and Social Justice Department at the university. So thanks for taking this time to talk.
Thank you.
If you haven't yet checked out this book, Judaism's A 21st Century Introduction to Jews and Jewish Identities, this ought to be on every shelf. So today our topic is about the genocide of indigenous populations and the grappling with that mess decades or even centuries later around justice, apologies, reconciliation. So what got you interested in this work originally?
So I founded and co-directed a nonprofit that worked with Jews, Muslims, Israelis, Palestinians for 10 years called Abraham's Vision. And how I got into that, it's a whole different segment. But in short, I was at an interfaith conference with other groups around the country, focusing on my work within Abraham's Vision. And we're in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And the night activity, one of the nights, there was a 30-minute movie we saw. This was September 2008. 30-minute movie on something that happened in Australia in February 2008 that I knew nothing about. So the movie, what it's about, and the project moving forward, on February 13th, 2008, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologized to the country's indigenous Australians, Aboriginals, and Torres Strait Islanders. And it was his first official act as Prime Minister. It was the first day of being Prime Minister and his first official act. And knowing somewhat about some groups in the world, certainly knowing about Israel-Palestine, that mess, knowing about the Balkans, knowing something about Northern Ireland, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, particular groups, South Africa, but not knowing anything about Australia, I was really intrigued and taken by and moved by this film. Even though on some level I'm not necessarily cynical, but have 2 feet on the ground when it comes to reconciliation efforts, I was still like, wow, that's incredible, because I'm thinking of it as someone born and raised in the United States of America, where there's been really no solid reconciliation efforts with Native groups here. So that planted some serious seeds, and 5.5 years later, I was able to go with my family to Melbourne, Australia for 6 months and do research.
On a Fulbright program? Yeah.
On a Fulbright scholarship, and did research on what does this apology mean. And I interviewed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and whites and everything in between, politicians, religious leaders, media pundits, academics, scholars, about 75 formal interviews and hundreds of informal interviews. It started off as a window into what is that apology, what is that day, and really, once you enter the rabbit hole of any research project, it was like, okay, well that's like the tip of the iceberg that day, and really was just intrigued by the situation with the indigenous groups in Australia. And because I'm an American going to Australia, as opposed to as a Jew studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or as an American studying situations in America, I really have no dog in the fight of Australia, of what's going on there. And I don't think objectivity or neutrality, I don't believe in those things, but certainly was not emotionally caught up in it, other than reading heinous things that happen to people and human connection. So then I came back to the States in 2014 after 6 months over there, and started putting all of this into the written page. Eventually finally got an interview with the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, to ask him what were his intentions with the speech. And shortly in 2015-16, while I'm writing, I realized there's no possible way I can, with intellectual honesty, approach this topic without putting my cards on the table as an American. Every time I talk about this project to Americans, people are always intrigued when I talk about over there what happened. And only when, it depends on the where someone is on the political spectrum of if they'll bring, oh, that's really interesting because our Native American, like if they connect the dots. But I think it's very easy to talk about and study, frankly, something that happened literally on the other side of the planet when it doesn't have any explicit connection to what goes on in your own backyard. And eventually then I started studying what has gone on here with Native American groups and teach a course on this stuff. As someone who grew up in the Jewish American community, 13 years of Jewish day schools, I learned about the Shoah, the Holocaust, the Jewish genocide aspect of World War II from probably way too early an age. And because of that, I knew from a very early age that bad things could happen in this world. But in general, I was raised thinking of bad things happen to us, us Jews. And over the course of time, I've certainly been able to widen my scope and be like, okay, unfortunately, we're one of many groups that has been marginalized and persecuted and oppressed, and that's not uncommon to marginalized peoples. So I kind of enter the entire topic with, the last book I wrote, Judaisms, is particularly on Jews, and tries to put it into some sort of comparative framework, because most of my students at school are non-Jewish, yet it's still about the Jewish peoples. This project, some might think on face value, like, oh, how did you get from there to there? But for me, it's actually, it falls under studying marginalized groups, social justice and injustice, and identity formation. And particularly with Native groups, the identity formation is always in relationship to, and usually top-down imposed upon them by oppressors. And to me, the dots connect very easily.
What's happened in the last 10 years since that speech in 2008?
Well, it depends who you ask. From my limited, removed perspective, there have been efforts, and by and large, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have felt that those efforts have all failed, by and large. And there's an intense distrust of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders of the Australian government for a lot of very, very valid reasons. So on some level, you could say, well, progress has been made. Well, I'm not entirely sure that really in the last 10 years progress has been made in Australia. And then you compare it to America, and you're like, well, we haven't even done that. We haven't had a sitting president apologize. We've had episodes here and there. So Congress has apologized to Native Americans, but the fact that nobody knows that is very important. I'd say the ritual nature of February 13th, 2008 has a certain power. The whole country knew that Kevin Rudd was going to deliver this apology. There were all sorts of rituals around the country. You can find an apology by Congress, I think it's in 2009, to Native American groups, but it's hidden inside of other, like a bigger, larger bill, and it's very clear at the end, no reparations will be made, so that has a certain legalese of, to take a Jewish approach. If I apologize to you, and I go through Maimonides, okay, I regret what I did, I acknowledge what I did, I commit myself to never doing it again. If there's ever a but, nothing I said can allow you to take me to a court. If, but at the end of any apology, I think weakens it.
Right. So how would you compare the Holocaust, the post-Holocaust responses to the American and Australian situation?
So it depends on from whom. In Germany was the first country in the 20th century you had sitting heads of state. Arguably, that's the phenomenon of sitting heads of state apologizing for something started with Germany. And it was either 52 or 53, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of Germany, apologized to Jews. Now, you could read the apology, and as my take as an academic would be, it's pretty weak. There's a lack of agency in it. There's a lack of ownership of the atrocities, and frankly, it was only a few years after the Shoah. I think timing with apologies is also critical. But then in 1970, you had Willy Brandt, then Chancellor of Germany, who allegedly in an impromptu act, he, as sitting head of state of Germany, visited the Warsaw Ghetto and was putting a wreath down, and he dropped on his knees. Now, his apology, he didn't say anything, but you can find it on YouTube. The power of a wordless apology. I don't think anyone now could do it. It wouldn't have the same power because he already did it. But also had a certain power. So in terms of the Shoah, the Holocaust, it depends on who's apologizing. To his credit, I guess, Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of Germany in the 50s, he was the one who pushed forward reparations to Jews, most of which went to the State of Israel, some of which went to Jews outside the State of Israel, so-called diaspora Jews, through a certain organization. But, even in the State of Israel, that was a huge, huge controversy. Should Jews accept reparations money from Germany? And Ben-Gurion, being a pretty solid pragmatist in his political approach, was like, we need the money. But there were many Shoah survivors in the State of Israel who thought that he was a traitor. And,
Right.
So in a certain sense, efforts for sure have been made by Germany in particular. But, in any given genocide, there's multiple culprits and multiple people who stood by. And
Yeah. So moving from the historical to the normative, what do you think Jewish theology or Jewish ethics can offer for a process for apology and reconciliation, for a process of teshuvah, of essentially repentance for historical genocides?
So I teach a course in the spring. This is my 4th or 5th year in a row teaching. It's called Forgiving the Unforgivable. And I give them a baseline definition of an apology. So I give them more or less from the Mishnah Torah. I give them Rambam's definition of the 3 parts, and then a fourth part, kind of with an asterisk, is if you're in the same situation again and you don't do it, right? So I think that's a very good baseline. I don't think Rambam came up with it. I'm sure other scholars, we could trace it back to other groups, but I think that's a helpful framework to study apologies. But ultimately, as my students and I, when we learn together, is the delivery of an apology is as critical as anything else. Just like all the statistics out there of how much of communication is body language as opposed to what's actually coming out of my mouth. So you can apologize, you can give the best apology ever, but if your delivery, if someone thinks you're insincere, or your delivery's flat, or someone thinks you're boring, there's all these subjective criteria. That said, I think the tip of the iceberg that what Judaism can offer in the conversation is Rambam's efforts, and then how to receive an apology.
Is there, what happens when there's not a receiver? Meaning, when you're not the one who directly was affected, can you receive?
So that's also a huge piece of the puzzle, right? Of reparations were being given by Germany, first off, to the State of Israel is a whole controversy in and of itself. Yes, the largest group of World War II refugees ended up in Israel. Second largest ended up in Australia. So no reparations went to Australia, technically. So who is on the receiving end? And obviously the people receiving it, when it was that first generation, the people receiving it, many of them were survivors, right? But say with Kevin Rudd in Australia. So he's apologizing, by and large, his apology focused on something called the stolen generations, where generations after generations of indigenous Australians were kidnapped from their families and put with whites. And not allowed to speak in indigenous language or practice culture, etc. So in a sense, Rudd was apologizing for things that had been done prior to his watch. And in theory, there's been a lot of discussion since that the stolen generations have continued, even after Rudd's apology. But putting that aside, Rudd would say that he was representing the country. His predecessor, who was in power for 11 years, John Howard, Howard's line of argument was, I cannot apologize because I didn't do it. Right? So you also have, from a textbook definition of reason and rationale, there's a logic to that, right? But then people would come back to Howard, be like, well, then how can you, but you do say that all the positive things that have happened in Australia's history, you'll take credit for, but you won't take credit for the evils. So that's one basic critique. But the notion of substitution, I think, is a huge piece of these apologies, because a lot of these things happened long time ago.
Yeah. So maybe the last question, in thinking about reparations, do you believe they should be applied to the African American population in America and to the Native American population? And how do you respond to that typical critique of taxpayers having to support that who weren't in some way responsible?
You know, when I first was introduced to that idea of, and before I got into this path of study, years and years ago, of African American reparations for slavery, for things that happened, I thought it was somewhat ludicrous. But that was because I didn't see the direct connecting of the dots. Granted, I had to study this on my own. Fortunately, there's a great number of books out there on it. But if you could look at slavery into Jim Crow, into post-Jim Crow so-called civil rights, into, in theory, if African Americans have been equal according to the law from 1964 on, which is a huge if, well, that means that for roughly 350 years they weren't equal, and now there's a short window when they are. So even if I don't connect the dots for you, which it's not difficult, it would take 5 minutes on that whiteboard to connect dots, and say, well, this dot represents slavery and this dot represents that. Even if I didn't connect the dots, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, okay, 350 years as unequal, at best 50, 60 years as equal, even though that's, again, arguable. Well, of course. So the structural content of the United States of America has been a country based on inequality. So absolutely I'm in favor of reparations for African Americans, absolutely in favor of reparations for Native groups. Hawaii was overthrown. It was a kingdom, for all intents and purposes, its own country, and the American government went in there and took it over. I mean, there's all sorts of really horrible parts of the history of the United States of America, and I don't think those things can ever be undone. But I do think that, just like on a very small level, if I wrong you,
right,
depending on what I did, maybe we can never get past it, but the only thing I can do is engage in tshuva.
And even getting beyond the point of teshuvah, beyond the point of justice, there's the point of social mobility and the privilege that has come with that history, which one wouldn't have had. So in fact, one is paying for the privilege they've received. Some have argued that the only reason America was able to get ahead globally was because of being able to leverage slavery.
Sure.
So all of the benefits that have come with that. So wonderful. So check out this book, Judaisms, if you haven't yet, and this next book coming out around the aftermath, the reconciliation and forgiveness that, or apologies that comes from the oppression or the genocides of marginalized populations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Keep up the terrific work.
Thank you.